back with Carolyn Grant. Carolyn, there's a lot of terms, words that lawyers put into contracts to protect either the buyer or the seller or make the contract work. Let's talk about some of those terms. Is the duration, the length of a contract, is that important?
Oh, extremely important for both the seller and the buyer, and for different reasons. Often a seller of a service or a product is going to want to tie that buyer into that contract for as long of a period of time as they can.
Like my cable contract.
Exactly.
Okay.
And often they'll want a contract that is automatically renewable. So at the end of the term of the contract, whether it's 5 years or 1 year, the seller is going to want it to automatically roll over into another term of the contract. Now, if you're the buyer, on the other hand, you may want a contract that's of less length, not as long as the seller might like it to be, and you also don't necessarily want it to automatically renew. You may want to have you and the seller agree to renew it, take an action to agree to renew it, and do it that way.
So the one party may want a contract to automatically renew unless an affirmative action is taken to stop it, and the other one might want an affirmative action to in the opposite.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yes,
Well,
that's
interesting.
exactly right.
What about this thing, termination of rights under contract?
Oh, huge thing.
Tell me about that.
I got to tell you, too, between you and me and the lamppost,
Okay.
that in the situations where a client has come to me and has been concerned that the contract has been broken, that it's been terminated or hasn't been terminated, depending on the circumstances,
Right.
that the first terms I go to in a contract are the termination rights. I always go right to those termination rights and find out what they say.
So you could write in terms that say if these certain things happen, the contract ends. Here and now.
Absolutely you can.
Okay.
And then there's also, along with that, because you can have termination rights say anything you want, really, anything the seller and buyer both want. But generally speaking, you're going to have two categories of termination rights. And those are, we terminate for convenience, we can terminate at any time for any reason, or we terminate for cause because somebody's done something wrong and hasn't fixed it.
Right.
So those are your two general categories. And in certain cases, the seller and the buyer may have different termination rights under the contract. That's often the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and because of your experience, you're familiar with the types of termination rights that certain industries would want.
Yes, and it's more seller buyer specific, I would say, not so much industry related.
Okay.
It could be, but not so much that I can think of off the top of my head.
Well, let me ask you this: once a contract ends, as you said, termination of a contract, would a contract still say that there might be obligations after it ends?
Well, a contract can say that, and it's important that it does in many cases.
Okay.
And those terms are what is known as survival terms, that survive the end of the contract, whether it's terminated or expires.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I absolutely can. Some good ones to think about that you're going to want to have continue after a contract ends are the governing law of the contract, the state law that governs that contract.
Okay.
And also dispute resolution, how any problem between the buyer and the seller, or whoever the two parties are, is going to be resolved. For example, what if one of the parties says the contract ended and the other says it didn't? If you don't have those governing law terms there and those dispute resolution terms there, it's not going to be clear how that's going to be resolved.
So you could put terms in that before somebody goes to court, they have to go to mediation?
Absolutely, you could.
Or you could have in there that they don't ever go to court, they go to binding arbitration.
You got it.
Okay, that's very interesting stuff.
Yep.
What about pricing terms?
Ooh, pricing is huge for both the buyer and the seller. You want to know what you're paying for what, and you want to know what you're getting for what you're providing to that buyer as the seller. And so getting those pricing terms right, and whether there are increases in pricing over time in a longer term contract, whether interest is imposed at certain points if somebody doesn't pay on time, all those things are critically important.
What about payment terms? Is that important also?
Oh yeah, payment and invoicing terms are also critical. Because if you're the seller, you want to make sure you get paid and you get paid timely. And if you're the buyer, you want to be clear on exactly when you're going to have to pay and how.
And how much?
Absolutely.
So these are all terms that you would consider basic in any of these contracts?
Basic and critical, yes.
Well, thank you very much for explaining that. Carolyn
You're
Grant.
welcome.
All right.
Thank you.